Lady Jane Grey never intended to become Queen of England, and unfortunately for her, many people around her shared the same opinion. With Amazon's My Lady Jane wowing fans and critics alike, it's time for a rundown of the brief history of England's 9 Days Queen. Plenty of words have been written about the drama of Tudor England. Perhaps most notably, it was at this time that Henry VIII, who broke away from the Catholic faith while dumping Catherine of Aragon for Anne Boleyn, reigned. Ultimately, Henry cycled through 6 wives and produced 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and his longed-for male heir, Edward. On his deathbed, Henry may have sighed in relief, believing that, for all the trouble he'd caused, his bloodline would continue through his son. Yet years after his son became Edward VI, the boy king died and left the throne of England wide open. That's where Jane Grey came in. As a cousin to Edward VI, there was no denying that Jane had royal blood. What's more, she was a devout Protestant. That put her in a truly awkward position, as some Protestants wanted her on the throne. Meanwhile, others thought that the Catholic Mary should take over her younger brother's job. Ultimately, as the Amazon Prime series My Lady Jane depicts, Jane Grey was pushed onto the throne and within the space of only 9 days knocked off it again.
His Majesty named you heir to the crown.
A few months later, Queen Mary ordered her execution. Though much of her story concentrates on those fateful few weeks just after Edward's death, there's more to Jane than her time as a maybe Queen of England. Life in Tudor England held a variety of different paths for women, though nearly all of them were limited by rampant sexism and poor education. As a result, girls of many different social classes were often given subpar tutoring. In fact, in the 1580s, educator Richard Mulcaster even said, quote, "Naturally, the male is more worthy of proper education." Since most women's roles in society revolved around their husbands or male relatives, parents saw it as a waste of time and resources to produce learned daughters. At best, some girls might get an apprenticeship that could help them be semi-independent. However, the Sisters Who Would Be Queen by Leanda de Lisle says that there was briefly a trend where the upper class did educate their daughters. Frances, Jane's mother, appears to have been set on making sure her daughter followed the fashion. Jane seems to have really taken to her education. She was so into classical works, in fact, that she preferred reading to more popular pursuits like hunting. She once said, "I wished all their sport in the park is but a shadow to that pleasure that I find in Plato. Alas, good folk, they never felt what true pleasure meant." In a letter, Jane once praised God for sending her, quote, "so sharp and severe parents and so gentle a schoolmaster." Her ambitious parents, Francis and Henry, wanted Jane to be ready for whatever political machinations they produced for her. To that end, they apparently became extremely demanding and wouldn't tolerate the slightest slip-up. Jane wrote of her parents, "Where I speak, keep silence, sit, stand, or go, eat, drink, be merry or sad. I must do it in such weight, measure, and number, even so perfectly as God made the world, or else I am so sharply taunted, so cruelly threatened, that I think myself in hell."
Jane, you have no power.
Her tutor, John Almer, however, was so kind to Jane that he soon became a beloved fixture in her life and a relief from her mother and father. However, some historians think that Jane may have embellished the situation to gain sympathy. Notably, The Economist notes that after her death in 1554, Jane quickly became mythologized as a martyred innocent. As Jane grew up, England was ruled by Edward VI, who had inherited the crown when he was only 9 years old. Henry VIII's widow, Catherine Parr, even briefly plotted to marry Jane to Edward in a deal brokered by her husband, Thomas Seymour. Then the young king grew terribly ill. By January 1553, Edward had contracted tuberculosis, and by that spring it was obvious that he was facing death. It's not clear if his plans for the succession, which ousted his sisters in favor of Jane Grey, were his idea or those of the Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley. Northumberland was Lord Protector and one of Edward's closest advisors. He was also as much a loyal Protestant as the king he advised, and the father-in-law of none other than Jane Grey, who had married his son Guilford in 1553. As it became clear that the unmarried Edward VI was deathly ill, he drew up a devise for the succession. In this document, Edward tried to make it so that the crown would only go to his female relatives' male heirs. However, there were serious issues with this plan. First, his 2 elder sisters had been declared illegitimate at one point by their father Henry. A 1543 statute had opened up a way for Mary and then Elizabeth to get the throne anyway, but that didn't sit well with Edward. He was a faithful Protestant and Mary was a devoted Catholic. A Queen Mary could completely upend the Protestant Christianity that had just begun to take root in England. Edward's new plan, created under the influence of the Duke of Northumberland, named the devoutly Protestant Jane and her male heirs as the new successors. Northumberland was a Protestant powerhouse and political heavyweight. After a great military victory in 1549, he became Lord Protector, effectively granting him the power of regent to Edward VI. Upon realizing that Edward was dying without legitimate heirs, Northumberland very likely pushed Edward to name Lady Jane as the true heir.
Your sisters are not the only ones we have at court with royal blood.
Unfortunately for Northumberland, the document the king produced landed in a legal gray area, leaving just enough room for its validity to be questioned mere weeks after the young king died. After a months-long struggle with tuberculosis, the 15-year-old Edward died on July 6, 1553. Just 3 days later, Jane was brought to Sion House, Northumberland's home, and informed she was queen. Apparently, this was the first time that Jane herself learned of her place in her father-in-law's plan to maintain his power. According to Eric Ives' book Lady Jane Grey, A Tudor Mystery, the whole thing came as a shock to the 16-year-old girl. A number of men appeared and knelt before the confused and increasingly distressed Jane, and upon learning of the king's death, she began to weep. She said, "The crown is not my right and pleases me not. The Lady Mary is the rightful heir." However, the combined forces of Northumberland and her parents convinced her that not only had the king basically commanded her to take over, but that it was her duty as a faithful Protestant to keep Catholicism from regaining power over the royal throne.
From now on, we address her as Your Royal Majesty, Queen of England.
According to Ives, Jane later told Queen Mary that upon hearing that she was to succeed Edward VI, she prayed to God that she would only take on the role if it was, quote, rightly and lawfully hers. Of course, this may have just been careful phrasing in front of a potentially vengeful monarch, rather than her actual reaction upon learning she'd been crowned. However, it's safe to say that Jane was probably reluctant to take such a visible role in a time of great religious and social upheaval. It's also possible she agreed to become queen in order to keep others away from power. She was already a well-educated young woman and could very well have seen that the Duke of Northumberland meant for her to be a simple pawn in his quest for power and influence. According to the sisters who would be queen, she must have known that her father-in-law wanted to make her husband King of England. Being father to the king would have made Northumberland potentially even more powerful than he was when acting as Lord Protector for Edward VI. Whether or not that's true or a rumor handed down through the ages, it's possible that Jane agreed to take the crown to curb some of his influence. Surprisingly, Jane showed signs that she wouldn't easily become Northumberland's puppet. For example, most people expected that Queen Jane would make Guilford her king. However, according to Ives, she quickly decided that, while she would be happy to make her husband a duke, Guilford was pretty much never going to be king if she had anything to do with it. Unsurprisingly, this caused a fair amount of strife. Jane's mother-in-law, the Duchess of Northumberland, was reportedly furious upon learning of Jane's decision. She told Guilford to stay away from his own marriage bed and to come back home to Sion House, but Jane commanded him to stay with her court instead. For his part, Guilford did try to pretend he was king by attempting to take charge of council meetings, but it was clear he was just weakly swiping at control. While Jane was trying to navigate her sudden new job as Queen of England, another woman was preparing her own counterargument. Mary Tudor was shocked to learn that her younger brother had skipped her in the line of succession for one of their cousins.
"I'm not stupid. I want Jane Grey's head on a pike."
For Mary, the matter of Jane's Protestantism was also alarming. As a lifelong Catholic who was horrified by her own father's break with the church, she was determined to take the throne and bring some old-fashioned religion back to England. Because of her royal pedigree and in spite of her Catholicism, Mary was able to garner enough support to defeat Northumberland's scheme. Ultimately, it all came down to numbers. Most of England's people supported Mary, arguing that the throne was rightfully hers. While Northumberland quickly left to suppress Mary's forces, the royal council suddenly reversed position and declared him a traitor. Mary was now the official queen, and Jane was in a lot of trouble. Northumberland's army soon dwindled to pathetic numbers as his men deserted him. He was captured on July 20th, the same day that Lady Jane and her young husband were promptly put into the Tower of London. According to the Tudor Society, Northumberland was executed on August 22, 1553. Meanwhile, Mary finally got what she wanted when she was crowned on October 1st. For a while, it seemed as if Jane and her husband Guilford might just escape the headsman's axe. After Mary took power, the pair were imprisoned in the Tower of London, but they weren't executed post-haste. Rather, they were put on trial for treason and condemned, but many believed she would not be executed. Mary apparently didn't want Jane or Guilford killed. It's possible she hoped to produce an heir of her own to negate Jane's claim to the throne. Yet even with Jane locked away in the Tower, a rebellion nearly toppled Mary anyway. Sir Thomas Wyatt led a group of rebels into London after Mary committed to wed Prince Philip of Spain, a foreigner and Catholic. Jane's father Henry was one of the rebel leaders, and pretty much sealed Jane's fate as she stood to remain a Protestant figurehead. As long as she was alive, Mary and her council reasoned, rebels would organize around her. It also didn't help that Jane had reportedly written an open letter condemning the Catholic Mass and telling Protestants to, quote, return again unto Christ's war. Lady Jane and her husband were both executed February 12, 1554, and Guilford Dudley went first. Though Jane didn't have to attend her young husband's execution, his body was taken past her lodgings just as she was walking out to her own doom. The sisters who would be queen says that Jane reportedly cried out at first, before collecting herself and announcing that the pain of her loss would pale in comparison to the wonder they awaited in heaven. On Tower Green, Jane ascended the scaffold in a plain black dress. As she addressed onlookers, she admitted that she had taken part in unlawful actions, but told them, "I do wash my hands defense thereof in innocence, I look to be saved by none other means but only by the mercy of God and the merits of his only Son, Jesus Christ. According to Ives, she remained composed except for a brief moment where, blindfolded, she could not find the block where she was to lay her head. She then called out to God and was dispatched in quick order. She was only around 17 years old and would forever be remembered as the half-legitimate 9 Days Queen.